Uh, my name is Frank Ferretti. I'm the director of MCC Brussels. I'd like to welcome all of you to this event. When we organized this meeting, we weren't really sure whether it was going to be a funeral or a celebratory occasion. Fortunately, it turned out to be a magnificent day, one of the most exciting days in my life. And one of the things that occurred to me, and this is, I think, a major challenge for all of us, is to try to learn what lessons we can draw out from what happened, how we can apply it, some of those lessons, to what's going on in Europe, in our respective nation states. And I think in particular what I think is really crucially important is that we combine our appreciation of the great job that the Republican Party and Donald Trump has achieved with an assessment of what is really going on here, what was really important. The main lesson for me in terms of what happened is when you look at the election campaign, it became very evident that this was not an election campaign in the ordinary sense. What was at work was not a political party, but a movement. I think that's the big achievement of Donald Trump and of the party, that they managed to create a real living grassroots movement. And it seems to me that one of the things that's missing in Europe amongst the different patriotic groups is their difficulty or lack of willingness to build similar kind of grassroots movements, which they will need if we're ever going to triumph and form governments in the different nation states. But the important point I want to emphasize is that although we're celebrating tonight, bear in mind that the really difficult problems lie ahead. The really difficult problems that are to do with how you govern a big state like the United States, how you cut across the sabotage that's going to be thrown at Trump by the deep state and by the bureaucracies that exist. And the one thing we should always remember, which is, to me, the most important challenge, is although Trump has managed to win the election, and we have the House and we have the Senate, nevertheless, those people who are in charge of American soft power are still there in Hollywood. They're still there on the television channels, they're still in the media, and in many respects, they are the biggest problem that confronts us at present time. So have a good discussion. I'm just here to welcome you, and I hope that this discussion will carry on a long time after today, because the momentous events of today and yesterday are ones that are going to have to be learned, and we have to be able to, in a sense, rise to the occasion ourselves, so that we too can make Europe great again, that we too can triumph politically and intellectually and morally, and that we too get out of the woodwork and show ourselves in public and create a movement that can actually call into question the dominant narrative that prevails in Brussels. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is John O'Brien. I'm Head of Communications with MCC Brussels. Welcome to this MCC Brussels event and a live recording of the MCC podcast, Unpacking the American Election. This is where we're going to dive deep into the results of the recent US election and what they reveal about the current political, social, and economic landscape. In this conversation, we'll explore voter trends, the issues that mattered most, and how demographic groups engaged with this election. Beyond the numbers, we'll discuss the broader implications. Did this election signal a path towards increasing political polarization? And what did it tell us about the deepening divisions in American society? What role did social media, independent candidates, and first-time voters play in shaping the outcome? Together, we'll unpack what these results mean, not only for the next administration, but for the future of American democracy itself. So, Donald Trump has sealed a historic victory in the US presidential election, and completed his stunning political comeback. The Republican comfortably defeated Democrat Kamala Harris in what polls had suggested incorrectly would be a very tight election, after he swept several key battleground states and won a commanding lead in the national popular vote. He becomes the first former president to return to the White House in more than 130 years. And at 78, he's the oldest man elected to America's highest office. Trump won the overall popular vote nationally, a feat he fell short of when he was first elected in 2016. As expected, Trump has dominated conservative strongholds from Florida to Ohio, while Harris won the liberal states from New York to California. Harris, a woman standing for president, campaigned heavily for abortion rights. Despite all that, she may have underperformed with women. Some 54% of female voters cast their ballots for her, the numbers indicate, but Joe Biden won the support of 57% of women in 2020. Black and Latino voters also appeared slightly less to support Harris than they were back when with Biden 4 years ago. Instead, Trump swept the key battleground states and smashed the Democrats' once vaunted blue wall of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, with Michigan also leaning his way. In what would be a major boost for a Trump presidency, Republicans have won control of the Senate after wresting 2 seats in West Virginia and Ohio from the Democrats and seeing off a competitive challenge in Texas. Neither party seemed to have an overall edge in the House, which Republicans narrowly control. However, control of Congress would allow Trump a relatively easy pass to his key proposals through to legislation, including his pledges to enforce mass deportations of illegal immigrants and to enact sweeping tax cuts. He has also vowed to drastically reshape the federal government, pledging to dismiss thousands of career civil servants and replace them with political appointees. At his rally in Florida, Trump said he had won an unprecedented and powerful mandate to impose his agenda. Tonight, we're joined by a great group of panelists: Dr. Richard Johnson, Senior Lecturer in Politics, Queen Mary University of London, author of US Foreign Policy, Domestic Roots and International Impact. We're also joined by a fellow American, Patrick Egan, publisher and CEO of the Brussels Signal. And finally, Craig Willey, French-American political writer and consultant. Thank you for joining us tonight. MCC Brussels, what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation here for a bit, and then we're going to take it out to you in the audience. At MCC Brussels is a think tank. We were founded 2 years ago. We're relatively new, but we really welcome all opinions, all questions, all considerations. So we're going to be coming out to you, the audience, and I'm going to ask you to carefully think of the questions you want to ask or the points that you want to make, because we want to hear from you. I'm going to start with you, Richard. If you were to tell a story, what happened? What happened in this election? What for you was the story?
Thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all. This is a remarkable political comeback, and in American history, there's only been one other president who was president, lost the White House, and then returned 4 years later, Grover Cleveland, in the late 19th century. And that was a time when the debates in American politics were over bimetallism, whether the base of US currency should be gold or silver or something else, or the use of paper currency, which might feel a little bit removed from us today, but at the heart of it, this was a discussion about populist economics, in effect. This was also a time when there was a discussion about policy relating to immigration, particularly from China. And this was a time when there was an insurgent populist party. The origin of the American tradition of populism comes from this same time when Grover Cleveland came back to the White House. The other example I was thinking of great political comebacks is Richard Nixon, who was the last nominee to lose an election and then come back and win a presidential election. He lost, of course, against John F. Kennedy in 1960, sat out 64 and came back in 68. But this victory, I think, for Trump is on a greater scale, and the scale of the comeback that Trump has experienced, I think, blows both Grover Cleveland and Richard Nixon out of the water. I mean, I think you have to even go back 2 years ago, after the midterm elections. People were not expecting necessarily that Donald Trump would be the nominee. I mean, there was a lot of discussion after the midterms where the Democrats had done much better than expected, that various Trump-aligned candidates had lost races that they were expected to win in states like Pennsylvania, that they thought that the Trump magic had worn off. His family had walked away from him. Ivanka and Jared were no longer on the scene. His sons were still loyal. There was an expectation that Ron DeSantis could defeat him in the Republican primaries. And then he defeated DeSantis. He defeated Haley. He won the nomination. And he's just won the presidency. And so this is the sort of the narrative arc of this election is one that really doesn't have a parallel in American history. I think the other thing that has given it a sort of sense of added intensity is that although statistically speaking, a Trump victory was always a likely outcome, in the sense that it was almost as likely as a Harris victory if you were looking at the polls. The commentariat had talked themselves into thinking that there was no way that Trump could win. People talked about the Trump ceiling, and they had talked themselves into thinking that he had crashed in the final weeks of the campaign, and that she'd had this strong finish, and it was going to be just a cakewalk. And so I think the commentariat has also caught itself by surprise in a way that they shouldn't have, but they did, and that's why we're seeing some of the emotional response to his victory at this very moment.
Thank you. Patrick, what do you think the story is?
Thanks, John. Thanks for organizing this panel, and it's great to be with all of you. I have to say, I've always found it fascinating the degree to which there is this fascination overseas with U.S. politics. I'm delighted to see so many people here to listen to this conversation or to take part in this conversation. On some level, as an American born and raised, while I've lived here in Europe for a couple of decades, I find it flattering, and I think that it's a statement on an expression of, at some level, the quality of political contests in the United States. And I was reminded of that over the last couple of weeks in particular as I was reading and listening to the commentariat in Europe talk about U.S. elections and the current contest. And reminded of a headline in November 2004, already 20 years ago. Many of you will remember this. November 2004, the day after George W. Bush was reelected president of the United States. And the headline that appeared on the front page of the Daily Mirror was, "How could 52 million people be so stupid?" Right? Some of you remember the comment. And I think, listening to some of the comments we've seen over the last couple of weeks, there is a similar kind of tone to the narrative, commenting particularly on Trump's candidacy, a kind of a wonder at how this particular candidate could still be competitive and, in fact, could win resoundingly as he did yesterday. And I think that particular headline or that particular story that the Daily Mirror running with that illustrated a couple of things, and I mentioned that for these reasons. One, I think it's interesting. It illustrates the fascination, the persistent fascination with U.S. politics. But more importantly, two, I find as an American still a persistently poor understanding in Europe among the press and among the commentariat of U.S. voting, of American voters, of who votes and what they vote for. it has been a crazy election. Maybe as we get into the discussion, we can talk about some of the things that that affected the race, because the turns of events over the last 12 months alone have really been extraordinary. Something from fiction rather than otherwise. But we talked a little bit before we sat down here about going back to the question of who is voting and why they're voting, what they're voting for. I think one of the most interesting parts of this story, John, is the fundamental shift in the voting coalitions that we're seeing in the United States. What we're seeing is that the Republican Party is now become the party of the working class. Once upon a time, I would say that up until about 2020, the main dividing factor in among the political parties was income, was class defined as income. And roughly speaking, the Democrat Party, like to describe itself, and to some degree was true, was appeal to a lower income voter, and the Republican Party drew its support from a higher income voter. But by 2020, income no longer dictates the divide. It's really, if you look at the 2020 elections, Biden won among low-income voters by only 8 points, which is significant compared to significantly low compared to previous elections. Whereas among the higher-income voters, the two candidates, Biden and Trump, were evenly split, indicating that the lower-income voters are not necessarily owned by the Democrat Party, and likewise with the higher-income voters. But by 2020, and it's been shifting obviously gradually, but certainly more pronounced in 2020 and yesterday. The main division among the electorates has become education. So the real divide is along the lines of education. So a college degree now serves as the dividing politics. And we can go. I hope we'll discuss more of the exit poll data. But it's not only I would say it's not only education, but also the Republican Party and Trump in particular have now begun to win support more among a working class coalition. Certainly the Republican coalition has grown among a working class population and has attracted a more ethnically and racially diverse group of voters. So really non-college voters are now estimated to make up about 60% of the current electorate, and 70% of those are estimated to vote more conservative, more Republican these days. Some real quick exit poll numbers, and exit poll numbers are soft, right? And more accurate or more data will be coming out in the next couple of days. But according to exit polls, Trump took 45% of the Hispanic vote. That's a 13% increase over 2020. Trump won 20% of the black male vote, again, against a candidate who identifies as black, right? 20%, this is a 1% increase over 2020. So a marginal increase, but still 1 in 5 of the black male vote, and it didn't decline or remain stable, it even increased by a small amount. Trump won 54% of the Hispanic male vote, so a majority of Hispanic male vote, which is an 18% increase over 2020. Among Hispanic women, 37% to Trump, which is a 7% increase. Among 18 to 29-year-olds, Trump apparently took 42%, which is a 6% increase. 18 to 29 years old were previously, considered a given in large pluralities or even majorities to vote Democrat. Yeah, go ahead.
Just come to Craig.
Yeah.
Craig, what's your initial takes from what happened?
So I think we have a clear progression, a few stages in this election that also say something about the candidates, say something about Americans and the choice that they had, because I think it's important to emphasize they had a real choice. We often criticize American politics for saying it's a kind of uniparty where you vote for one candidate or the other, you'll get more or less the same package. Here, I think that's really not the case. So the first stage was Trump sticking it out. So despite the losing in 2020, despite or even thanks to the court cases against him, which in some cases seem to have been politically motivated, and in any case made him more popular. So it helped him in the Republican primaries to have these court cases against him. He stuck it out. He beat the other Republican candidates. He had a very clear set of messages about tariffs, which is for American workers, about cheap energy, about mass deportations, which is the flip side of 8 million illegal immigrants estimated to have arrived in the United States under Joe Biden. That's 2 million people per year. It's enormous. And it is a violation of his oath of office to uphold the Constitution of the laws of the United States. And I think that's one of the massive reasons why Trump was able to win, was the Democrats' failure on that. Then we have more on the personalities. So Joe Biden, of course, had a severe cognitive decline over the last 4 years. Already wasn't so sharp 4 years ago, but that was only revealed with the debates, with his, I don't know what word to use. It was an embarrassing performance. It was embarrassing for him. It was embarrassing for the country in some ways. It was embarrassing for everybody who covered up for him. The Democratic Party, Harris, and much of the media covered this up, and it was only with the debate that they realized, absolutely, we cannot let this continue on autopilot. We have to change our horse, and I think that was a wise decision. It showed that the Democrats have some sense. They put Harris, but the basic problems the Democrats have is they don't have a clear narrative of why you should vote for them. Trump had a few simple messages that I mentioned, and Harris could not distinguish herself from her predecessor and was running away from her track record, running away from her comments about banning fracking, running away from the fact that she had been in charge of overseeing border security, running away from the fact that she had said in writing that she wants to have trans-affirming care for illegal immigrants. I mean, you think this is from an SNL sketch, but this is what she wants taxpayers to pay for. And this did not resonate with voters. She was wooden. She ran away from her record. Trump, whatever you think of him, was being Trump. And that was the case when he got shot. That was the case when he donned the McDonald's uniform. And it resonated with people. And I think these are sort of the immediate political trends, but there's also longer-term ones about demographic trends, about an important segment of Silicon Valley coming behind Trump with Elon Musk. And one thing I do want to emphasize, and we have mentioned, so the huge amount of Hispanic support for Trump, which shows a racial depolarization of U.S. politics. Yeah. And I think this is important because so much of the hysteria about Trump is motivated by the fact that they think this is KKK adjacent. This is the white racist coming back again. Absolutely. Look, 52% of Hispanic men, 45% of Hispanics overall. This means something else. This is a multiracial national populism where Americans are saying, we want our government to at least act like they're standing up for us. Act like it. Police the border, defend our jobs, do something. And the Democrats weren't able to deliver that.
Thanks. Because there definitely were issues that really wrong-footed everybody. You have Latinos voting for Trump, in spite of the fact that stopping the illegal immigration, closing the borders, was one of his main talking points. You have a black vote that did not vote as strongly for the Democrats as they did previously, in spite of the fact that we have a woman of color standing for president, and he's been openly accused of being a racist. The black vote did not go in the way that they expected it to go. The women's vote, Kamala definitely invested the Democrats a lot in the abortion issue. We also have a woman standing for president, but the women's vote, again, was down for the Democrats. It also was the case that in states where there was ballots about abortion issues, while people voted for the ballots around abortion issues, that didn't automatically translate into people actually voting for Kamala Harris. So there's a lot of these sort of wrong-footed type of issues. Richard, what were the wrong-footed issues that you noticed, and why did everybody get those issues so wrong?
So I'll pick up on a few of those issues that you raised. So on this question of, does a more permissive immigration policy attract Latino voters? I've always thought that this was a flawed assumption. By definition, Latino voters are US citizens in order to vote. And therefore, they are either born in the United States or they have become naturalized US citizens. And there we might expect that people who have gone through the process of naturalization in the United States will have a different view on people who have come to the United States, have perhaps not gone through the formal processes, have not have outstayed a visa or not even come in with a visa, and have not gone through that process. That is a difficult and time-consuming and costly process. And I think it's not a surprise that Latino voters would not necessarily want to have a system that was very permissive of a very open immigration policy. The African American vote, I think, is interesting here, and I do think we need to be careful about assuming that there's been a similar shift among black voters as there has been among Latino voters. I mean, the exit poll, I think, suggests that Trump won about 12% of the African American vote, which is similar to what Pew's validated voter survey suggested he won last time. What I think is interesting is that the share of African Americans as a proportion of the overall electorate is down. And what that suggests to me is not necessarily that black voters were switching to Donald Trump, but that black voters were disproportionately staying home. Okay? And so that's also a register of discontent with the Democratic Party, even if it doesn't mean that people are switching, making that full switch from Democrat to Republican. And then on the abortion issue, as you mentioned that, I just want to touch on that one as well. This was an issue that Democrats expected to be the game changer in this election. And they felt that, okay, if the Democrats are going to lose ground with Latino voters, there was some discussion about losing ground with African Americans. There was some expectation of further sliding with non-college whites. We can make it up because degree-holding, particularly female voters, but maybe also their husbands, will vote for Harris because they are upset with the Dobbs decision and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And yet, if we look at the exit poll, 1 in 3 American voters said that they believe that abortion should be legal in most but not all circumstances. We might expect this to be a group that would break heavily for Harris. And yet Harris only won this group by 3 points. Okay, she got 50% to Trump's 47%. And I think what has happened is that Trump was very effective at signaling his distance from the more extreme or the outlier elements of his party on the abortion issue. And reporters thought this is, he's getting some flack from evangelicals. This is, bad news for Trump earlier in this year when Trump had equivocated even whether he might even have voted. He was thinking about voting for the Florida measure that would have liberalized abortion in Florida. And then he kind of changed his mind on it, but he seemed very muddled on it. But actually, I think signaling that he wasn't someone who actually personally believed in an outright ban on abortion gave voters who believed in abortion in most but not all circumstances that permission structure to vote for Donald Trump. And that actually took the wind out of the Democrats' sails on that issue.
Thank you. Patrick?
Yeah, I think that fundamentally the election was about the economy and personal finances. The grocery bill, the utility bill, the how much they're having to pay for rent compared to 4 years ago compared to their real income. And Vice President Harris's challenge was, because it's a change election based on economic issues, it was her challenge to frame herself as a change candidate, therefore completely distance herself from the Biden administration. And then also be able to convince voters that she would be competent on these economic issues. And ultimately, she didn't close the sale, whereas Trump really focused, when he was disciplined on his message, immigration was secondary. The first issue always was about finances and about the so-called pocketbook issues.
Yeah. Greg?
So I would highlight maybe two things. One is how wrong the polls were, and we didn't know before the election how wrong they would be. They were wrong in 2016, they were wrong in 2020, they were wrong in 2022, although 2022 they understated support for the Democrats. So pollsters try to get it right, but it seems like they've not found a methodology that works, at least for Trump. So that's something to bear in mind, I think, in all elections going forward. And a second thing, and this links up to what was just said about abortion, which is that this is about the Supreme Court. So abortion is very controversial. It's a very sensitive issue, understandably so. The reason it has become an issue now is Trump appointed justices who are originalists or textualists, that is to say they try to interpret the Constitution reasonably to its original meaning and not to make things up, found that abortion is not a right protected under the U.S. Constitution. And I think if you read that short document, and it's only 4,400 words long, and it's a very interesting document, I think it is very hard to argue there's a right to abortion in that document. There's the word abortion and the words privacy do not appear in the Constitution, for example. And what that means is now abortion is decided at the state level. So, of course, it does make sense for Democrats to campaign on abortion, but it is not the case that Americans in their states are disempowered. On the contrary, you can vote in your state and decide how it should be. And I think the Supreme Court is a very important institution, and it goes against this democratic idea that Trump is now going to be a dictator. The U.S. Constitution has set up a system of checks and balances. They have a small majority in the Senate, I think 52. We're not sure whether they have the majority in the House. And the fact is, Trump does not own the Supreme Court. He appointed some of the justices there, but really they are people who are committed to a conservative interpretation of the Constitution and not to doing Trump's bidding. I think it's really a disservice to those justices and to really distinguish schools of constitutional thought to say, no, this is just a puppet court and Trump can be a dictator. There's checks and balances. We live in a democracy, and it's very good, I think, that more decisions are made by people locally in the states in general.
One of the keys to Trump's success was this power of a grassroots movement that he formed. It was an unexpected break from the usual orthodox Republican tactics that you'd expect. And we're looking at a campaign, a raft of different constituencies that he managed to form, more focused on the interests of voters than on the identity of voters. And what do you make of this grassroots movement that is MAGA?
Yes, so I guess this is to me, first of all.
Yes.
To me, yeah. So I distinguish this in two ways. So first of all, in terms of the on-the-ground activism in this election, the reporting that I've read suggests that the Democrats did actually have a very extensive, as they called it, ground game. The Democrats had raised a lot more money than the Republicans and were able to invest that on more boots on the ground on election day. And I think one of the things that these elections of the last few cycles have shown us is that just getting people out and knocking on doors is not necessarily sufficient to obtaining victory. That there is a whole online environment now which is becoming more and more significant, and in many ways, actually, the way that you are more likely to reach voters now is through social media and through digital means than knocking on doors or ringing up people in an age when people don't answer their phones and don't answer the door to people they don't know or live in environments where it's even difficult to find someone's front door. So that's just on the kind of practical matter. So then on this kind of on the grassroots, the Trump movement, the MAGA movement. I mean, Trump has benefited from having a core constituency that is very loyal to him, that trusts him, that is willing to see beyond when he might make mistakes or put things in a way that causes pushback against him. And I think that we can't underestimate the importance of that actually for a politician to be able to have that loyal core. Now, that's not to say that these are people who have no thoughts of their own and they just take all of their signals from Donald Trump. But it does mean that when the going gets tough, Trump has a cushion, has a base that he can kind of return to and rebuild in a way in which most politicians don't have that. And when the going gets tough, the foundations fall as well.
Yeah. Patrick, what do you make of MAGA?
I would underline what you've just said. I think two factors in that. If we're talking about something about grassroots, I think one of them is Donald Trump himself, much more so than Kamala Harris, elicits a very, very strong response, both on the positive and the negative side. His detractors have very, very strong criticisms of him, and his supporters are fervently supporting Donald Trump. He's a cult of personality, as you alluded to as well. So he is able to drum up a lot of support. His rallies have large size, large attendance. Fanatic response. If you've ever attended one of those or seen one of those, it's really something to behold. The second part of that, though, is what we alluded to earlier. If we're talking about grassroots, I think the shift in coalition, again, I think is one of the big stories in current U.S. politics, and that the Republican side of U.S. politics has been able to now attract support from working class voters and those who are very, very sensitive to the economic issues. They've been able to broaden their coalition, and that includes voters that Democrats were able to rely on for many cycles, certainly throughout my youth. And they've struggled to replace those voters with a different kind of voter, and have fled to more educationally polarizing cultural issues, which proved to be, I think, divisive among the Democratic voters.
Thank you. Craig, MAGA.
So I think this is actually a very important question for the future, which is not so clear, because so much of MAGA is driven by Trump's personality, which is essentially driven by his appeal on media, reaction, and social media. So will this remain after Trump is gone? I'm not so sure. He has appointed J.D. Vance as his vice president. First candidate and now to be the next vice president of the United States. And that was a signal that he wants MAGA to continue as his legacy in the Republican Party and not fall back on the old coalition, which was essentially religious conservatives, big business, and neoconservatives. I would say that would be the previous trinity. And now they've added the working class into there. And they might continue on those issues of border enforcement and protecting American workers if they see that it pays off electorally. And I think J.D. Vance will want to continue in that direction. And this new element of the tech right, as I say, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Mark Anderson, I think they're going to stick around because they want to be able to innovate. They want to be able to continue to do things in America and not face the kind of stagnation that we have in so much of the rest of the world. But I think it's a really open question. And one of my concerns would be that it fizzles out, because MAGA country, it's often parts of the United States that are hurting. It's less educated parts, sometimes less socially cohesive, and there's a risk that it fizzles out. But I think they are working to make sure that isn't the case.
What's Europe to make of Trump's victory? First of all, as regards the establishment, the political parties in Europe, the EU, Ursula, what are they to make of this victory, and what way will they process it? Second of all, is there any message for Europe? Hell knows no fury like a populist vote scorned. And certainly that was the case in the United States. This is a populist vote. There's populist votes happening in Europe, have been happening over the last period of time, and we can expect more. So what can Europe make of it, both in processing it from the point of view of, now that he's won, how are they going to react to it and manage it? And second of all, is there a message there that be afraid, be very afraid?
Well, I think it's time for Europe to wake up and grow up. And the Trump election is, in some ways, is an opportunity, could be seen as an opportunity for European states to think about what direction they want to take their country and the direction of Europe on the world stage. What is Europe to stand for? What are the nations of Europe to stand for? Particularly, this is something that in Britain we need to think very seriously about, which is, what is the role of the United Kingdom in the 21st century today? And I think that the Trump presidency will, on a very basic level, will put more pressure on European states to take a look at their defense budgets. But I think also it will make them think about the different alliances that they're forging, their political economies. We in Europe have allowed ourselves to be babied by the United States, perhaps for too long. And so I think this is a moment for potential change. Which direction that goes into is I think, more of an open question, but I think that is the juncture that we are at.
Patrick?
Yeah, three things. The sky is not falling. It's going to be fine. Donald Trump is a very transactional politician domestically, but also internationally, and he's all about asserting U.S. national interest first. So understand what that U.S. national interest is, as interpreted by the Trump administration. You're going to understand which direction they're going. Number two, listen to your voters. Take a hard look at election results in the Netherlands last year, where the economy was the primary issue, particularly housing. Take a look at recent elections at the state level and the European parliamentary level in Germany. Take a look at recent elections in France, and learn some lessons from what's been going on there, and listen to your voters. Number three, significant change is coming to the discussion around the war between Russia and Ukraine, which is going to be a good thing.
Craig, it's interesting that populism, it's been compared to fascism in recent days. People talk about hard right and far right. Populism is about the will of the people. It's also about listening to democratic voters and listening to how voters feel and what they believe in things. We haven't seen a lot of that in Europe in recent days, a respect for a popular vote.
Well, I think that's one of the major lessons of this Trump vote, is to respect your voters. And in many European countries, and this is starting to break down, by the way, because the Trump phenomenon is unique to the United States, but you have similar concerns about immigration, national sovereignty, and well-being, the economy in European countries. And you've had these so-called far-right parties for decades in Europe, for a long time, more so in Europe than anything comparable in the United States. And the default reaction is to simply exclude those people, is to say, your vote is not legitimate, your representatives are not legitimate, you don't exist politically. And this is not going to pay off in the long run. And most often it's done, as you've just mentioned, with references to the Second World War, to fascism, to Nazism, when oftentimes this is a facade. You have French politicians like Lionel Jospin, who's a former senior socialist leader, who said that when in 2002 Jean-Marie Le Pen got to the second round, there was the cry of anti-fascism, and everyone stood up against him, and Jacques Chirac, got 90% of the vote. And he said, it was theater. We knew even back then that his party was not a fascist party. Even back then we knew it. So Marine Le Pen, even less so. So we have to stop with this hysteria, with pseudo-fascism. We need to respect voters, and we need to have discussions. Like, I don't see why the cordon sanitaire exists in every country. I think we should be able to talk with elected representatives, no matter what they are, assuming they don't advocate, violence or tyranny. But they're a normal democratic party, as almost all these parties are. I don't see what the problem is. And we have seen breakthroughs in Italy with Giorgia Meloni, with the Sweden Democrats supporting a government in Sweden, in the Netherlands, as was just mentioned. And I think that's something they need to take into account. The second thing is Europe needs more strategic autonomy. It needs to develop its independent capacity. This is a long-term endeavor. I want to manage expectations on that because it's very hard to get those 27 cats to agree to anything. But there was a good suggestion by Klaus Welle, former, I believe, Secretary General of the European Parliament, who said Giorgia Meloni could be a good person to talk to, on behalf of Europe, to talk to Donald Trump to. And I think that's an excellent idea, because I was even racking my own brains about this, of how is the EU going to talk to Trump when he wants to raise tariffs, and this kind of institutional, legal, bureaucratic way of doing things is really not his style at all. It really has to be like a heart-to-heart personal rapport. And, Giorgia Meloni could be a good representative, perhaps.
So we're going to come out to the audience in a moment. But before we do, I just want to do a rapid response from you. What is Trump likely to do when you think about immigration, when you think about Ukraine, when you think about tariffs, the economy? What do you think Trump is most likely to do soon?
Well, I'll just take the first one you mentioned, which is immigration. So one of the things that Trump talked about on the election campaign was the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. This is legislation which allows the president to, in a sense, fast track or leapfrog some of the judicial processes that are required to deport someone through normal means if they can be designated by the president as being part of an invading force. Now, this is legislation that has its origins in the 18th century, but it was used in the 20th century, both in the First and the Second World War, including by Franklin Roosevelt. Many of its associations are not particularly pleasant or popular associations, but it was interesting that Trump talked about this in the election. And I think, I think Trump is using it as leverage more than anything else, but he's sort of saying, look, if the legal process is going to make it complicated or difficult for me to pursue these deportations, then I have a legal mechanism to leapfrog it. So I'd look at that. And then just the second thing is, I think Clarence Thomas is going to retire. I think in the next 18 months, he'll be gone. And so I think one of the first battles, not battles, but the first big choices of the Trump presidency will be, who does he replace Clarence Thomas with? And he has a healthy Senate majority now. So he could even lose a couple of Republicans and still be able to put someone. So if you were thinking about the previous justices, I take the points about them being serious legal scholars. I don't always agree with their legal interpretation, but I accept that. But they're not MAGA. They don't come out of the movement in the same way. I wonder if Trump will look for someone who comes out of his movement to put on the Supreme Court this time around.
Interesting. Patrick, what can we expect?
On immigration, the emphasis would be on border security and reducing the number of illegal entries to zero or as near zero as possible. I think deportation is a big question mark. I would have my doubts about whether they will go there. On Ukraine, expect some very assertive foreign policy to bring the two parties to the negotiating table. I think the big question on that one is whether he does that with any European partners, whether he can bring some European Union member states or European governments on board to do that together with him to move toward a negotiated solution as quickly as possible. And on tariffs, it's going to be all about those manufacturing entities that are willing to manufacture in the United States and create jobs in the United States. Otherwise, expect more tariffs.
Okay.
I think more border control will happen. There will be legal attempts to get illegal immigrants to leave, for example, by making it impossible to employ them or by cutting off public services to them. There may be major conflicts with blue states over that because you'll have sanctuary cities, you'll have blue states will not cooperate. On the other hand, there's an interesting asset of American federalism, where you see blue states are losing people because they're too expensive, because they don't have jobs, their economies aren't growing. So this is New York, California, Illinois, big states, and red states are growing. So there's this dynamism, this sort of selection of models that work in the American system. So they can have those sanctuary cities. It's not necessarily going to help them in the long term. But I think a lot of less illegal immigrants will come. We saw that in the first term. People just understood, okay, we're not welcome. Like, we have to go in through the front door. We're not allowed to sneak in. I think people will understand that. For tariffs, we will definitely have tariffs of some kind. What level, I think is harder to say. And then for foreign policy, frankly, I think this is the least predictable for two reasons. One is Trump is not very clear on foreign policy. He doesn't have a coherent foreign policy philosophy. He's often not thought about these things, I think. Probably he has by now, but certainly not when he started in 2016. And also, it's not clear that his State Department, his national security apparatus, that the blob, as was called under Barack Obama, it's not clear that the blob will cooperate with him. I didn't cooperate with him the first time. He'll has a better shot at it this time because he has the Republican Party behind him. But it still remains to be seen. I mean, Trump is a great showman, but it's maybe not the best day-to-day manager. I think that can be said.
Thank you. So now it's your turn. I want to come out to the audience. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and wait until the microphone comes to you, and then speak into the microphone. You can ask a question, or you can give an opinion or give your feelings on what happened in the election. I'm going to start with this lady over here on the end. Yes. Please stand up.
Hi, I'm Michelle from Germany, if that is of any interest. I have a question for Patrick, because you said that in Europe we do not really understand the Americans enough when it comes to elections. So I want to know what you think we have to understand better, because in Europe, and I've seen some questions basically to Germany, but also other countries where it said 85% of Germans would have voted for Harris. And so maybe what you can say on that. And then I have a question maybe for all of you, there's the time to answer, what you would say on the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. That's correct.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a couple of questions and then we can come back. Yes, this gentleman here.
Hi, Kyle Green from White and Case. I like to think that mega has a better ring to it than MAGA, but in order to get there, in my view, the European Union has to walk through the fire of a trade war with the US to form a steel union. That's one point. So that means that we, need to at least have the political perception that there's going to be a trade war with the US to create that European unionization effectively. And I wonder what's your opinion on that. The second point, there are 2 points here. We have trade and we have defense. And I wonder, on the UK, how do we bring the UK in from the cold, trade-wise, to make it an ally? And then on the defence front with the UK, how do we create a cohesive union for defence without the US?
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Yes, this gentleman here.
Hello, I'm Dominic. You mentioned about transformation of Europe needs to undergo because of the elections and so on. Macron mentioned that if we continue further with the bureaucracy that Europe has, it wouldn't work out. What is the kind of revolution that has to be done in Europe, and how do we get rid of the bureaucracy?
Okay. So, Patrick, do you want to start with your question? What is it that Europeans need to know about America?
Thanks for that question. I think, fundamentally, just one basic issue is just to respect that, allusion to that headline that I mentioned from the Daily Mirror. How could 53 or whatever it was at that point, 53 million people be so dumb? Obviously, they were being very Daily Mirror-like in their hyperbolic headline, which was a great headline. But these voters are not dumb. Even if even if Trump is winning from a coalition of less educated voters, the fact that one person hasn't gone to college, doesn't have a college degree, doesn't mean these people are dumb or lacking in common sense, right? But that understand that the voters are motivated and making decisions based on very rational calculations. This particular election, it was a change election. It wasn't the status quo that they wanted to continue, but they wanted change, and it was all about economy. And they felt, at least according to the results, like a much larger number, a plurality of voters felt like Donald Trump could do a better job with the economy. So it's based on rational decisions. One of the other things I think, too, that runs, just really quickly, that is abrasive for Europeans, and I can understand why. But a U.S. president does not have to engage in any kind of internationalism or multilateralism in the way perhaps a European leader or a European head of government does. I mean, the question of being European, a chancellor of Germany or the president of France, there is a European dimension to that by definition today. The U.S. president does not have to engage in that, and the U.S. president can be unapologetically, America first, and that doesn't cost the candidate any points. Quite the contrary.
Thank you, Craig. The January happening at the Capitol, and what did you make of that?
Well, I think there's still a lot of open questions about exactly what happened, but this is my interpretation at the current time. I think Trump really amped up the rhetoric. He refused to concede. He gave the impression to a lot of his followers that they're going to change the result with the speech he gave. He said, "I will be there with you at the Capitol." And they went there, and then someone let them in. So I don't know what happened, but they got in. It was not a coup attempt. There was no organization. There was no plan. But those people went in. They thought they were changing it, the result. And immediately when I saw the photos of them, I felt sorry for them, because I could tell that these were internet people. These were some of them were conspiracy theorists. Some of them were just people who came from their small towns and came over to try to change things. I knew they didn't understand what they'd gotten themselves into, and I knew they would pay a price. And I knew that Trump would not be able to help them even if he wanted to. So that's my assessment of Jan 6th. And I understand that people find that event offensive. And
do you find it offensive?
Oh, well, it is a violation of the U.S. Capitol. So it is offensive. And I understand that it can be a deal breaker for many to say this is it's definitely not an acceptable event, but to want to cut off a person because of that, I can understand that.
Yep. Anything you want to add?
Yes, I mean, I will just say on the last election, I mean, we talked about earlier that the lesson of Trump is to respect the voters, and I don't think Trump did respect the voters after the last election. And I think that is important to say. For all of the ways in which, we might see Trump as having made important interventions on certain policy areas, or to give voice to communities that felt that they had been neglected, he did refuse to concede the election, and I would hope that Harris will not follow in his footsteps in the weeks to come, and that she will set an example, because if you get into a habit of not of losing that principle of losers' consent, then democracy can get in a very bad way. We saw it in Britain with the people refusing to accept the vote to leave the European Union from the other side. And I think that we just cannot get in. We need to respect the outcomes of elections, whether we like them or not. On the question about the UK from Kyle, I mean, it's interesting. Obviously we have this new Labour government, and our new Chancellor Rachel Reeves has been a great admirer of the Biden economic agenda. Her May's lecture was an ode to Bidenomics and ideas of onshoring or friendshoring is something that she is very interested in. And I guess I would advise from the European perspective is that if you want to try to, I mean, I'm not sure it's no more cold than usual in Britain, but if you want to bring Britain in from the cold as you see it, then I think using that kind of language of friendshoring might be a way of making some inroads with the current chancellor.
Okay, thank you. Let's come out to the...
Can I just add one point? I'm glad there's a point on which maybe there's some disagreement on the three of us. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that on the 2020 elections, the institutions and the media definitely did put their thumb on the scales to affect the outcome in the Hunter Biden laptop story. There was a coordinated effort to suppress that story and paint it as Russian disinformation, which is now, incontrovertible, and it had an impact. What kind of impact did it? Could have changed the outcome of the election? That's a question, but it certainly has not been acknowledged on a wide scale.
Good and important point, Patrick. Yes, this gentleman in the middle. Oh, that's gentleman. Yes, indeed. Microphone.
Microphone, isn't it? Anyway, look. I think that there are a couple of things that haven't been mentioned that I think are really quite important. The first thing is talking to people in America who've been going around and visiting, particularly the swing states. The point they make to me is this, and I think it's a rational assessment, is that actually a lot of people who voted for or who were thinking of voting for Trump actually do not have very high opinion of him. And many of them say that Trump cannot be trusted, that Trump lies through his teeth. And the reason why they're voting for Trump isn't because they're enamored by him or they have this kind of somehow this love of his charisma. The reason why they do it is because it's through Trump that they can express their anger and the fact that they're fed up with the way things are run in the United States. And quite often, the vote for Trump is as much a negative vote as a positive rejection of what the Biden-Harris oligarchy stands for. Now, to me, that's really good because it indicates two things. It indicates that these voters, these uneducated voters, are actually quite smart. They can see through the play acting of Trump. And secondly, it's important because it indicates that they have a capacity of making an objective assessment of their circumstances. And that is something really important because if we have citizens who are not going into this thing blindly, but know what the score is, that's very important for the future of democracy in the United States. The second thing that I think, to me, is the best thing that happened in the election, and something I wrote about, is that this is the first time since I've been around, and I've been around a very, very long time, that identity politics has suffered a serious setback. Ever since the early 1980s, from the 1970s, identity politics has gone from strength to strength. There's been an occasional backlash against it. A lot of conservatives laugh at identity politics when they say ridiculous things about gender, but they just laugh, while gender politics goes from strength to strength. So it's done really, really well. But this time around, what happened was the attempt at the identity appeals to women, which is what Harris tried to do, the attempt to kind of colonize the black and the Latino vote, the Hispanic vote, actually failed. And this is really important because the long-term strategy of the Democratic Party is to create a new constituency made of recently arrived migrants and immigrants to use their kind of cultural differences with the old America as a way of creating a basis for it, which is, by the way, what they're doing in Europe. Because in Europe, too, the different countries from France to sort of Britain and elsewhere do understand that mass migration, whatever problem it causes, is politically useful for them because they might become the new constituency that they can build on. So what is really important in America is that this has been rejected because Latino, Hispanic voters in particular realize that when push comes to shove, they're Catholic. And because they're Catholic, they have a certain traditional orientation that isn't susceptible to manipulation by identity politics. And secondly, they're hard-working people who realize that actually at the end of the day, they got to contribute to American society. So for me, this is the most important takeaway because if it can be done in the United States, then with a bit of luck and a bit of hard work and effort, we can begin to do the same thing to identity politics and identity culture in Europe itself. Give them a good rear up the rear end and demonstrate what a damaging role it plays in our world.
Thank you. There's two gentlemen over here. Javier? Yep. And sorry, no, if you could just wait for a moment. Yeah, sorry, Javier, first of all. In a moment, yeah.
Good evening. My name is Patrick. I would like to know, Trump declared that Hamas has to release the hostages before he gets in office. How is he going to do that? And how is he going to stop the aggression of Israel by Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran?
Okay, thank you. Javier?
My question was about the media coverage. What do you think about the media? I had this feeling that hasn't been the same as in 2016. Less psychotic behavior from the left, kind of. I would like to know your opinion. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, back here. Stand up, please. Yes.
Hi, Matthew Robinson. My question was more from a legislative standpoint. Based off the last Congress, the Republican has proved to be less than competent to try and articulate a proper legislative agenda. It looks more likely than not the Republicans are going to win the House, that they'll have a reasonable cushion in the Senate. How much confidence do you have that they will be disciplined enough to roll out a coherent legislative agenda in coordination with the White House? And is there perhaps a risk that in the absence of that, they could lose some more moderate senators, people like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, and that majority all of a sudden starts to wither away if they can't properly get their House in order?
Patrick, if we could start off on the media question, because this was a very different election. Like the fact that Joe Rogan's podcast was, a centerpiece, where legacy media really, they didn't have as much of an impact as they thought they did. Like weird things, like MSNBC would not play any of Trump's speeches because they thought they would be upsetting for people. Yeah. That's sort of weird behavior by the media. What did you make?
Weird. I mean, exactly. The mainstream legacy media in this election just should be merits an absolutely failing grade, an absolute gross dereliction of their professional duty. Much of them, at the level of editors and producers, just decided they were going to take a side in this election. I think one of the most grossest displays of this was the one and only Trump-Harris debate, which was otherwise not necessarily a great performance by the former president, and arguably a victory on the side of Vice President Harris in the debate. They could paint it as 3 against 1, rightfully so, because the two moderators from ABC were so conspicuously biased. Yep. And that wasn't just MSNBC or ABC, but it was across the mainstream media. The willful distortion of quotes from Trump. Most recently the remarks, somewhat unfortunate, but blatantly distorted the remarks about Liz Cheney. Rehashing things that had been debunked a number of times. So one of the things that both campaigns ultimately began to do, and particularly the Trump campaign, but also to a degree the Harris campaign, is they began to see that the voters don't really trust these outlets anymore. Mm-hmm. And so we have to go to these to these alternative sources online. Like Joe Rogan was the most prominent example, but there are many others. Right?
Mm-hmm. Craig, the last Trump administration, to say the least, it was a little bit chaotic. And he said he's learned from that. But this question this gentleman had, the ability of this new Trump administration to get through legislation, do you think they've learned sufficiently, or are we going to have more chaos?
Well, I think they will pass certain things which are popular and Trump has clear commitments on, so maybe enabling American energy, for example, maybe some of the tax cuts, like tax cuts on tips, for example. But to be honest, he has not articulated a broad domestic legislative agenda. Mm. And to that extent, it's hard for me to see how he can pass some broad program. Even presidents who do have a more clear agenda often find it difficult. So I wouldn't be surprised if that stalls at a certain point. I wanted to, if I could go back to a couple questions that were mentioned earlier. So one on Europe federalizing via trade war. Probably the U.S. Picking a fight with Europe would help to have more European unity to some extent. a bit like how you saw in Brexit. The Europeans were really quite united in those negotiations, maybe surprisingly so. But I don't know if that means you get lasting unity afterwards. You know, it's very hard to federate. You know, I've been reading up a lot on early American history, and it was very difficult, even for those first 13 small American states, to create a federal government. And obviously Europe, much more mature states, 27 different nations, you know, very difficult. And then as to what Europe needs to do to become more dynamic, I think there's a lot of things. I think you need to have more entrepreneurship. You need to have lower taxes. The pension system is really dragging down the budgets of virtually all countries. You need to have sane energy policies. The Energiewende in Germany, 2 trillion euros, I think, 1 or 2, questionable. Nuclear power is probably a good idea. And the Eurozone. You need to have a coherent Eurozone where the refinancing costs go down. We recently had the Draghi report on competitiveness, where they talked about maybe doubling the EU budget through European borrowing or taxes. I think that isn't a good idea. I don't think doubling the EU budget would help, but I think European borrowing to lower the cost of debt nationally, to reduce national debt, could give more leeway to nations. And that's what Alexander Hamilton and George Washington did at the beginning of the American Republic. So I think reducing debt is critical.
Richard, I know you don't have a hotline to the Trump administration, but looking at the conflict in Gaza, looking at the conflict in the Middle East, how would you guess he may decide to deal with that issue?
He's unpredictable, and that's part of his approach to foreign policy, is that he's deliberately unpredictable. But I guess Trump is, with respect to Israel, as sort of equivalent to Nixon with China, right? Nixon was, this is, if Trump wants to go and tell Netanyahu some hard truths and to call on him to slow things down, desist, reverse, he's got a certain credibility because of his past positions that will give him political cover both at home and in Israel, and for Netanyahu, in fact, in a way that neither Biden nor Harris would have. And so I don't know where he'll take that, but it was an area of policy in his previous administration that he had given a great deal of responsibility to his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, which led to the Abraham Accords and so on. And so there's a degree of interest at the kind of the heart of the Trump family, which might lead to some interesting results there, but it's very hazardous to guess.
Okay, back to the audience again. Please raise your hands. Over here. Yes, Patricia. There.
So as Jacob Reynolds from MCC Brussels, lots of the way that the media or, say, the Harris campaign would have characterized Trump was by using the term fear, that Trump was kind of bringing up this new sense of fear about immigrants or about what have you. And they tried to say that Harris was kind of the candidate of hope and Trump was the candidate of fear. And that never really kind of rang true to me. And because, after all, it was Trump who's saying, make America great again, right? We want to go somewhere interesting in America. And also even started talking about and bringing about a new American golden age. So I'd like to ask the panel, I take Frank's points completely that lots of the support for Trump is very kind of measured, bracketed, with lots of question marks and asterisks attached to it. But was a factor in the campaign also that he actually managed to motivate a sense that our lives could be better, we could be doing better than this, and that currently we're not delivering on anything that resembles an American dream?
Thank you. Here at the front.
Hi, Patricia Chagnon, former member of the European Parliament, here with Philippe Olivier, who is a sitting member. We were discussing, as you probably heard, whispering in French, a question. The woke movement in this election, which we sort of see as maybe sort of an underground revolution, which was basically going on, a smothered revolution within American society. What has that movement influenced on these elections? And can we say that with the election of Trump, we have now once and for all pushed that movement outside of society? Is that problem now dealt with? Or are we still confronted, will we still be confronted with that? How is that, how are we supposed to see that within the elections?
Thank you. This gentleman here with the beard. Here? No?
Hi, my name is Marx. The American people have spoken and democracy has spoken. There is an American democracy because there is a demos, there is a nation. So this MAGA movement is moving within an American nation. In European context, it's a very different thing. However, the revolt is the same. It is against a blob in America and against a technocratic, suprastate, supranational thing over here. Could you speak to how a mega movement, to call it that, could be copied or not, specifically knowing these differences and similarities?
Okay. Thomas?
Thanks. Tamás Orbán, European Conservative. I just wonder what you make of the 20 million missing voters compared to the last election. Because, yeah, Trump also lost votes, 3 to 4 million, but Harris, I mean, the Democratic Party, they lost 60 million votes, which is astonishing number of reduction in just 4 years. Of course, it was the last election that was the outlier, not this one. Which, the other reason I'm asking this, because you were talking about the January 6th, and there's a great sense on the internet among people who were believing that the election was stolen, that this new statistics somehow vindicates them.
Okay, thank you. There's a lady just at the back. Yes.
Do you think that the victory of Trump could be seen as a link with free speech, and that maybe free speech could have a role on the whole world, and so far it was also how can I say that X played a tremendous role in this victory. And what we were tweeting here was affecting in the US. And now, do you think that what happened in the US could have also a reinforcement in our free speech here in Europe?
Okay, thank you. I want to start with you, Craig. Is there any of those you want to pick up? I'm particularly interested in what the result of this election means for the woke incorporated.
I think that's an excellent question, and I have to answer pessimistically because I don't think this will make wokeism go away at all. I think it will still be massively present in the universities, in the media, in much of the youth. I mean, and you have a trend where, because what do conservative politicians stand for? They stand for usually the slightly older, more established members of the electorate, often family people, who don't want things to change too much. And they win by appealing to them, but they don't actually stop social change. So you elect Ronald Reagan, or you elect Richard Nixon, but those civil rights changes, those demographic changes, those changes between men and women, secularization, those are happening anyway. So you can have a win now with Trump, but wokeism will definitely be a force going forward. But what is interesting is, can it be contained? I mean, you definitely see how the Republican Party has emancipated itself from the media. It doesn't care about what the mainstream media says anymore because you have alternative media, you have podcasts. So for me, it's a really interesting open question going forward, how this will pan out. And certainly Trump will influence it because, for example, they might abolish the Department of Education. They certainly will crack down on critical race theory, which is essentially anti-white theory in universities. and they will protect free speech platforms like X. So it's definitely significant, but by no means I think wokeism is definitely here to stay.
Okay. Patrick?
I mean, that on that one, she won 66.9 million votes, Kamala Harris, roughly speaking. So that, to the extent that she enjoyed the support of those people who support a kind of a wokist-like agenda, or as Frank characterized it, identity politics, that's still a considerable force in U.S. politics, for sure. I mean, it's being painted as a resounding defeat, and some people are even using the word landslide, but in some respects, it still was a very close election, and she, like I said, 66.9 million votes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Richard, what do you make of this question about the missing voters?
Yeah, I'm not entirely taken by it because the votes still haven't all been counted. California has only counted half of its votes, so we should expect at least another 8 million votes to be counted out of California. Look, you get different turnouts at elections, and the last election, there were reasons why there were a higher turnout, because it was COVID, people were at home, a lot of states sent out postal votes to every voter. You know, you can object to that, but that is going to increase turnout because it lowers the thresholds, the barrier to vote. So it's not, to me, strange that 2020 had a particularly high turnout. And I don't think we can actually say that Harris, I mean, I do think that both candidates probably will have, at the end of the day, won fewer absolute number of votes than last time, but I don't think that's for any nefarious reason, and the votes still haven't all been counted yet.
In conclusion, unfortunately we've run out of time, but starting with you, Craig, and picking up on the point that my colleague Jacob Reynolds made about Trump offering sort of being an agent of change, wanting to instill hope, making things great again. Are you optimistic about the United States going forward?
Well, I'm definitely optimistic about the U.S. as a power and as an economy for a long time, because just look at the fundamental demographics. 1.6 children per woman, that's more than in Japan, more than Europe. Look at the kind of immigration that they get. It tends to be smart people. It tends to be people who work. You really can't just live on welfare in the U.S. so easily. You have cheap energy there. And look at all of the cutting edge technology. I mean, it's really getting dire, the level of technological dependency in Europe. You have the AI, the biotechnology, many space with Elon Musk, of course, many cutting edge sectors dominated by the US, and they have scope to continue growing. But I think that the risk for the US is what I would call the default path of social democracy, where you tax everything, you try to make everyone safe, you don't let anyone say anything, and it becomes this giant nanny state. And then you're down the road of stagnation and irrelevance. But so for Trump in particular, he'll have his 4 years, he will get certain things done. Certainly, I think his voters, they will get more manufacturing jobs, they will get cheaper energy, lower prices. So to that extent, it will be good. But I think also long term, there are reasons to be fairly optimistic.
Nice. Patrick?
Same question, optimistic or not?
Yeah.
Absolutely optimistic. I mean, one, we have now, we're going to have leadership at the top. The United States has suffered from a lack of leadership over the last 4 years, which was on full display, or the extent or the liabilities of that was on full display in that debate in July. And we've got a huge turnout again. You know, this is a really healthy turnout. A lot of people are excited about the new president and about our political system. There's a new energy about the country and political life. So I'm absolutely optimistic.
Richard, reasons to be cheerful?
In the exit polls, there were some striking responses to a couple of questions I just want to share. So one was, do you think the condition of the nation's economy is excellent or good, or not so good or poor? 67% of people said that the economy was not so good or poor. 75% of people said that inflation had caused them moderate to severe hardship. 43% of respondents said that they were dissatisfied with the way things were going in the country. 29% said they were angry with the way things were going to the country. And yet, There was a question, do you think America's best days are in the past or in the future? 61% said in the future. There is a certain optimism that is still there in the American spirit, that in spite of a sense of gloom about the way things are now, Americans have not lost their belief in themselves and in their country to chart a better path in the future. I think if that question was the reverse, that final question, and it was a third only had said in the future, I'd be much more gloomy about the prospects of America. But as long as there are still significant majorities of Americans who believe that the country's best days are in the future, then I think that that is a cause for being cheerful.
Will you please give our panelists a round of applause? I hope that you stay, and I hope that you join us for a drink and some snacks. I hope you get to meet and talk to some of the, especially if it's your first time here, talk to some of the MCC Brussels staff, and we'd be very happy to talk to you about what we're doing, what our plans are, and how we're planning to shake up the Brussels bubble. Before I conclude, my colleague Jacob Reynolds is just going to tell you about an event that is coming up soon, which you're all invited to.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I hope you can all hear me. So on your seat, you'll see there's an advert for a couple of upcoming events.